Hi, this is Guy Harris. Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast. This week, I'm continuing my 4-episode series about unintentional threat triggers based on the DISC model. And as I've said before, I want to remind you that if you'd like more information about the DISC model, some people call it the DISC model, you can check out our website, discpersonalitytesting.com. We have a blog there at discpersonalitytesting.com. We also offer assessments, both free and paid, and other training and learning resources that'll help you learn how to understand the DISC model, how you fit within it, and how you can apply that knowledge in your interactions with other people. Today, I'm going to talk about the interactions that can happen when people with a supportive style trait are involved in the communication. And like I've done in the prior 2 episodes, I'm going to look at both sides of the communication, both what it is that people with supportive traits might do that unintentionally trigger a threat for others, and what people can do in interacting with a person who has supportive traits that might trigger a threat signal for the person who has supportive traits. Person with supportive traits has the combination of attributes of a reserved pace, more careful or contemplative, more slow to engage typically, a little bit softer engagement, and people-oriented, focused primarily on relationship building, protecting, preserving relationships. And while people with supportive trait tend to have a relatively gentle approach to interaction with most people, I can't say this is universally true. I'd say it's generally true that people with supportive trait have a gentle engagement with other people. And so it might be hard to understand how a person with supportive traits could actually trigger a threat for someone else, because from a physically imposing or relationally threatening sort of perspective, it's hard to imagine a person who is gentle and kind and supportive and appreciative and helpful could actually trigger a threat response in others. Well, let's first consider what we mean by threat response or threat trigger. Threat triggers are typically subconscious, not conscious responses we have to other people's interaction patterns. They trigger, again, at a subconscious level, our fight or flight response. It typically shows up as irritation, frustration, stress with the interaction. And so what happens is anytime we're interacting with another person and their response or their engagement in the communication challenges or robs us of something we feel like we need from the interaction, it triggers a threat response. It's in response to that robbing of the need, not necessarily because the other person appears, in a classical sense, threatening. What is it that a person with supportive traits might do that challenges another person's needs? The most common place this could happen is when a person with supportive traits is engaging with a person who has dominant traits. Because they have a cross-style communication approach, they can interact with each other in ways that directly, at best, challenge and possibly rob the other person of their needs. In this case, a person with dominant traits typically needs the feeling of rapid progress, forward motion, problem solving, initiating action, those kind of things. And the gentle, careful relationship preservation approach of most people with supportive traits can be perceived by a person with dominant traits as if the person with supportive traits is resisting motion or resisting action or resisting making a decision. Now, what's probably true is that the person with supportive traits is trying to preserve the relationship by being gentle and not pushy. That's probably true. And for a person with dominant traits, the lack of decision, the lack of action, the hesitancy to move is actually a threat trigger. So what a person with supportive traits might do that could trigger other people negatively is to hesitate or delay decision, to be gentle rather than direct. Sadly, this behavior that becomes a threat trigger is actually triggered by a desire to preserve the relationship and unintentionally can hurt the relationship. That's why it's called an unintentional threat trigger. A similar kind of interaction can happen between people with supportive and cautious traits. A person with cautious traits probably wants to think about the task at hand rather than the relationship, and the softer, more gentle approach might, for a person with cautious traits, create some friction. It's not super common because it's often true that people with cautious traits share supportive traits with the person who has supportive traits. So there's likely to be a bridge there. It is possible, though, that a person with supportive traits, by being gentle and delaying a decision and answering indirectly, can actually create for the person with cautious traits a feeling of threat or a feeling of frustration because they're not getting answers to their questions. Now, what about a person with supportive traits interacting with a person with inspiring traits? This is typically a pretty comfortable interaction. It's not likely that you're going to see any kind of threat trigger issue here. possibly the pace of interaction could be frustrating for a person with inspiring traits. And because there's a relational focus in both cases, both the person with supportive traits and the person with inspiring traits, there's not a super high probability that it'll be a challenge. It is something for people with supportive traits to be aware of, though, that the pace of engagement might be a frustration for people with inspiring traits. And then a person with supportive traits interacting with another person with supportive traits, it's possible you could get a threat trigger signaled. It's unlikely, though. It's not common. So I wouldn't really worry about that one too much in most situations. Now, what is it that people interacting with the person with supportive traits can do that might trigger them negatively, might unintentionally cause them a feeling of threat? Well, anytime you push for action when they're not ready to answer the question, if you push for data when they're not ready to give the data, when you engage with the person with supportive traits in a way that comes across like you're more focused on the task accomplishment than you are on the relationship preservation, you run the risk. I won't say that's a guaranteed threat trigger. I will say that you run a very strong risk of unintentionally triggering the person with supportive traits in a negative way, causing them to feel a fight or flight response or causing them to disengage from the conversation. When you focus almost entirely on the transactional aspect of the relationship, when you focus almost exclusively on what needs to be done rather than focusing on the feeling of the relationship or the feeling of other people involved. So any heavy focus on quick decisions, on task over relationship, over results over relationship is likely to negatively trigger a person with supportive traits. A fast pace of speech, a face-to-face interaction approach, a direct question approach. All of these can come across to personal supportive traits as a bit intimidating, possibly threatening, and can cause them to disengage, shut down, withdraw from the conversation because you've unintentionally, in a desire to move things forward, in a desire to get an answer, in a desire to get a decision, unintentionally caused them an emotional response to your engagement, which then triggers them at a subconscious level to withdraw or disengage from you because you are perceived as threatening to them. Okay, what do we do with this? Well, as I've said before, the key is to understand where you fit in the DISC model, understand the things you might do that unintentionally trigger other people, and understand the things that other people do that might unintentionally trigger you. So my warning here is if you do not have supportive traits, beware of your pace and directness of engagement. If you do have supportive traits, be willing to cut the other person some slack if they're direct and engage very quickly and push for a decision. Remember that any threat you perceive is likely perceived rather than intended, and work on trying to adjust your perspective so that you don't perceive a threat. Again, benign intent, as I've said in other cases. Remember that most people don't do things intentionally to threaten you. It's often unintentional. For the person with supportive traits, beware of overreading other people's intensity. For people who do not have supportive traits, beware of being too intense, or being too direct, or being too quick, or asking too many pointed questions. In either case, if you're aware of where you fit within the DISC model, you understand the perspectives of other people on your team or in your family or in your business, customers, supervisors, coworkers, employees. Work on bridging the difference between you and them using the DISC model as a bridge. You can talk like a leader.
This has been the Talk Like a Leader podcast. You can listen to this show every week wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Guy Harris, and thanks for listening.